Let's talk a little bit about the history of archaeology, or the origins of archaeology. In your textbook, Scary mentions that archaeology begins about 500 years ago in the Renaissance period of Europe, but other people have suggested that it goes even further back in time. So if we go back about 2,500 years to Nabonidus, who was the last king of Babylon, he excavated the Temple of Shamash at Sippur, and he had a specific question he was addressing. So in that frame of mind, it is very archaeological in its modern sense, because it was problem oriented. He wanted to know who built this thing. Once he did his excavations, he actually set up a museum with the artifacts that he collected so people could see it. So that was another big first. Now, from the collapse of the Roman Empire to the Middle Ages, we really have the Dark Ages. So there's not much interest in the distant past. We see the Bible as the explanation for Europe as to what happened in the past, and that explained pretty much human behavior. So what's interesting is during this time frame, stone tools that were found were thought to be the results of lightning strikes on the ground. So really kind of in the realm of folk explanations of things that they were finding. And it's not until like the 16th century that we start to see some changes. We're seeing, the rise of the Protestant Reformation. We see a lot more exploration and curiosity. The Portuguese and the Spanish are already out and about exploring things. The printing press is also now available, and it increases the availability of knowledge to a much wider range of people. But it's not really until the 18th century that we really start to see some more interest in past behavior. So this is when we start to see the rise of anthropology and subsequently archaeology. So especially after a guy by the name of Frere in England at a place called Hoxne found some stone tools. Now this started to cause some debate over who actually made these. Were they actually formed naturally? Was it really the result of lightning strikes, or could it have possibly been fairies and elves? And again, keep this all in the proper time context. And people started to question how old they really were. Now, this isn't necessarily the start of archaeology in itself, but it's the start of this inquiry into trying to explain the artifacts that are being found. We can really kind of look at some beginnings of archaeology with John Aubrey when he started to map Stonehenge, and also Avebury, which is the largest stone circle in England. So he did some mapping and trying to find out, how these were made, who made them, and so forth. Kind of what I refer to as the shady beginnings of archaeology lay squarely within the antiquarians. And antiquarians were simply individuals who were interested in the past for profit. So specifically finding spectacular antiquities for both private collections and museums. And in fact, in the 18th century and even into the 19th century, and to a lesser extent today, but it still does happen today, museums like the British Museum and the Louvre paid for objects of antiquity. So they really kind of drove the whole pot hunting, particularly in the 18th and the 19th centuries. So antiquarians used non-scientific methods, so they were basically grave robbers. And two of the most famous or infamous were Giovanni Belzoni and Heinrich Schliemann. So let's take a look at Belzoni first. So in the early 1800s, Belzoni left his job as a strongman in the circus for Egypt. And once there, he spent about 5 years looking for everything from scarabs to statues to papyrus. He freely used a battering ram to get into different kinds of tombs, so he destroyed a whole lot of stuff, a whole lot of hieroglyphs, destroyed mummies by crawling over them, and of course falling rock from using the battering ram destroyed them also. But those were things he wasn't really interested in. He worked in the Valley of the Kings at Thebes, and he also worked at the Great Pyramids. In 1819, he had to leave Egypt relatively quickly, and the story goes it was in a hail of gunfire because they finally got tired of his looting of the tombs, and he was forced out of Egypt. Heinrich Schliemann, there's a little debate. Some people might consider him one of the first archaeologists simply because he did have a problem that he was trying to solve, and that he was trying to demonstrate whether the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey were true. However, he used unscientific methods. He was really more interested in acquiring treasure, so he didn't worry about keeping any kind of records of stratigraphy or anything like that. So he falls more in the lines of a pot hunter. At the site of Hissarlik in Turkey in 1871, he found what he believed to be Troy, and he found over 8,000 gold ornaments and other types of artifacts, which he believed was the treasure of Priam, who was the king of Troy, according to Homer's work. He also conducted mass excavations at Mycenae, and that's in Greece. He thought he had found Agamemnon's city, but the modern dating techniques show that the ruins he found actually predate the Trojan War by several centuries, so he was a little bit off there. But nonetheless, some really cool finds, and you can see some pictures of it on the web. Now, the first scientific excavation, particularly in North America, goes to Thomas Jefferson. So it may be surprising, but maybe not, because he was into a lot of different things. But he was scientific because he was problem-oriented. He had some mounds on his land, and he wanted to know who built them. So he went into his excavations with a specific question in mind. He wanted to know if these mounds were a natural occurrence, and if they weren't, who built them, and he wanted to know what was inside the mounds or buried in them. He also did this very systematically, so he didn't just excavate and collect things. He had a system in place to collect the data during excavation, and then he described it, so he put everything in context. So he talked about the location of the mound, the size of the mound. He talked about his method of excavation. He talked about the stratigraphy and the condition of the artifact. So again, it was very detailed, very forward-thinking for this time frame. And then he presented his conclusions, but he drew all of his arguments from the data. So he presented rational arguments. They weren't just things like, hey, I found this projectile point, it must be made from lightning, kind of thing. That's not really a rational argument. He looked at all of his data and came to the conclusion that it was local native populations that had, or the predecessors of the local native populations that had built the mounds. And then what's really key is he published. So again, he put his information out there for public scrutiny. And because of all this, Jefferson is considered the father of American archaeology. So a big, big step forward. He was the first person to use stratigraphic excavation in archaeology, and stratigraphy, and this concept of stratigraphic excavation, is really a cornerstone in archaeology. So stratigraphy is simply the superimposed layers of natural or cultural material. So here you can see what we call a profile, and you can see strata or levels. Some of them look like they have little round circles. That's usually an indication of boulders and rocks and so forth. Little dots might be sand. Something darker might be a darker soil. So we have different ways of drawing profiles, and we usually provide a key for interpretation. But this particular drawing gives you a good idea of what strata looks like. Now, one of the cornerstones of this idea of stratigraphy is this thing called the law of superposition, and this comes right out of geology. James Hatoun and Charles Lyell kind of developing some ideas even further back. Nicholas Steno coming up with some ideas that the layers at the bottom are older than the layers at the top, unless something like an earthquake has caused uplift to mess it up. So this provides basic ordering for the archaeological record. So when we're digging, we'll keep track of these strata, of what artifacts are coming out of which strata, so that when we go back to the lab, we can say if strata 1 is at the bottom, all the artifacts coming out of that are going to be older than anything coming out of strata 7 towards the top. So again, it provides a very kind of basic order. Doesn't give us dates, it just tells us what's older than the other. And when we're excavating, sometimes we like to excavate by natural strata. So we might create an excavation unit, divide it into 4 quadrants, and then we'll excavate opposing quadrants using arbitrary levels, so maybe like 10 to 20 centimeters. And then that gives us a picture of the stratigraphy, so then the remaining 2 quadrants we can excavate using the natural stratigraphy as defined by the 2 pits that we've already opened. So it's kind of interesting how we can use stratigraphy in archaeology.